Okay, so after the Brentford game yesterday, which Wolves lost 2-0, which I think was quite a big surprise to a lot of people and probably the worst performance under Bruno Lage, Raul Jimenez kind of came into probably the most criticism out of everyone in the side. Not like in anything nasty or anything, but I think a lot of people had questions about his performance, and that didn't really surprise me. I remember I did my match review after the game, and um, I kind of I spoke about it a bit, but I didn't think it'd become as big of a deal as it was. Like, I went on Wolves Twitter, and like some of the stuff people were saying was genuinely mental. And look, I'm not saying Raul Jimenez has had a great start to the season or anything, but I think people are overreacting a little bit. Like I saw this guy here saying, "Get Raul on the bench or even in the under 23s," and the guy's been wank and all that. This sort of stuff is just it's just the terrible side of Wolves Twitter, right? Whereas I think most people are being reasonable. Like I saw this tweet, Raul, I love you, but you need to get dropped. I can kind of understand this, right? Although I don't agree with it, I can kind of understand why people would feel like that. Um, but I don't. I think it was a bit over the top. Like obviously, I think the injury is irrelevant. It's not really a muscle injury. Like I don't think it will really change his play style. And we've seen him go up for loads of headers, and I think if you look at a lot of the data, it suggests that Raul Jimenez will just kind of start banging eventually. He's had the 18th most shots in the Premier League out of the 370 plus players that have had shots. Obviously, the big issue is they're not really on target, right? He's only had 7% of those are on target, which for an elite kind of level striker isn't obviously good enough. And out of all players that have had shots, he's got the worst percentage. Like if you look at there, 7% of his shots are on target, and then obviously below him, everyone's got zero because they haven't had a shot yet. If you get what I mean. So in terms of actually taking shots and getting them on target, he's literally been the worst player in the Premier League. Which I know it's not the most important stat, but I think it sums up his start to the season, right? But I don't think this means I think this doesn't really warrant the reaction that people were going on Twitter. Like I think let's say in that Brentford game or in the Watford game, let's say in the Watford game, Raul Jimenez scored the goal that Hwang got. I don't think anyone will criticise his performance today because he would have got that goal, which I don't really think's fair if you get what I mean. Like Raul Jimenez's issue for me is that he hasn't really had any clear cut chances. I think his XG this season's what? It's below one, which for a side that's had the amount of shots we've had is like genuinely absurd. Obviously, everyone knows our finishing problems. You know, we have an expected goal. Our expected goals versus XG is the worst in the Premier League, and look, that's not a bad thing. Well, obviously it's a bad thing, but that doesn't mean that's going to last forever. If you look at Brighton are all up there in the opposite side, whereas they were kind of where we are now. Same with someone like Neil Maupay, right? If you look at um, everyone that's had shots in the Premier League this season and how everyone's underperforming the XG, out of the 389 players that have had shots, if you look at the bottom kind of 20, five of them are Wolves players, and like three of them are our front line. Adama Traore and Karen Jimenez. Um, Obviously, this video is more on Raul Jimenez underperforming his XG and stuff, but the fact that our whole front line is in the bottom kind of percentage of people underperforming their XG, for me, that's more of a symptomatic thing than something you can't just blame on Raul Jimenez. And I don't really see what the alternative is with Raul Jimenez. He's on a big contract, big wages, and he's the main guy. You've kind of just got to trust him. And I don't think his work ethic's not there. I don't think he's not winning aerial duels. He's not pressing. All these things are still there. He is pressing. He's winning aerial duels. In terms of key passes numbers, he's in the top 10% for Premier League forwards this season. Like he's doing everything else. He's just not scored. But I don't think that's worthy of dropping. As much as I love Fabio Silva, Bruno Lage doesn't rate him that highly. Like he's not really trusted him yet, and I just don't really see what the issue is with Raul Jimenez. I think if he'd have got one goal, even if it's just a scrappy one in these games, no one would be moaning about it. And I don't really think that's a fair thing to do. Like these things don't last. Like even if you look at this stat with Jimenez underperforming his XG and stuff, Neil Maupay got bantered for that last season, and Neil Maupay's all the way kind of at the top in the top 20 now, and I just for me this is just a bit of a bad patch of form for Raul Jimenez. If the system changes, those shots that he is having will go on target because I don't think he's had any real. Maybe I'm forgetting something off the top of my head. Maybe that header last week against Watford, but I can't really think of an obvious chance Raul Jimenez has had. And for me, that's more of a system thing than specifically a Raul Jimenez style of play thing, if you get what I mean. And I wouldn't mind it if there was a clear rotation option. Like for me, Hwang Chang, I like what I've seen so far, but I think Bruno clearly sees him as a winger. That's why we loaned out Morgan Gibbs White to bring him in the first place. And he clearly doesn't trust Fabio Silva anyway. And the same people that want Fabio Silva to play are the same people that are probably slagging him off for not being clinical last season. You know, the only reason you could argue for Raul Jimenez being dropped, because even if you look at his numbers from the start of this season and just before his injury, where he was kind of off form then, all his creative numbers are really good. He's okay in the air. Like his pressures have gone down a bit, to be fair, which is a bit concerning. But that kind of takes into account the last season as well. But for me, there's no obvious alternative. Like if we had like, I don't know, let's say we'd sign like some really good striker in the summer, it was an obvious 9, then I kind of get it. But there's nothing obvious about what Raul Jimenez isn't doing bar scoring. Like he's doing everything else for me anyway. Like it's not a performance thing, it's just finishing. Everything else that is fine, and finishing is an overrated skill anyway. Like it's one of those things that eventually, if you have enough shots, you will score, if you know what I mean. Everything else is there. He's holding up the ball, he's okay in the air. I just don't really see why there's this this big cry to drop him, because there's no obvious alternative for this system. Clearly Bruno doesn't trust Fabio Silva, and neither do the fan base. Hwang's not a 9, and all of Jimenez's underlying numbers are pretty good. So for me, I'd just kind of, personally anyway, as disappointing as this Brentford game was, just let Raul Jimenez have a few more games. Eventually he'll get an easy chance like Hwang got last week, and he'll score, and his confidence will get back, and he'll be okay. He'll be fine. Raul Jimenez is an elite player. Even when he was good under Bruno, under Nuno, we all praise Raul Jimenez, not because he was this great finisher or anything. It's because he was a good creator, and he was good in the air, and he worked hard, and he kind of represented everything we wanted as a player. He's still doing all of that, it's just not finishing it as much. But I think that's more systematic of the system not creating big chances for him than him himself, personally. But that's just what I think about Raul Jimenez. If you enjoyed the video, like the video, subscribe to the channel for more Wolves and Premier League content. And yeah, peace.